All right. Welcome you to the last panel of the day. I'm particularly pleased to be part of this Central Asian panel because, as most of you know, I do my work in South Asia. But South Asia and Central Asia have very deep historical connections. And these two units that we have at the IS, South Asia and Central Asia, are actually new units, relatively new units at the IS, and represent really new areas of focus for the IS. And it's particularly important because, you know, we are trying to venture outside the Arab Middle East and going into other regions of the world where there are substantial Ismaili traditions that have generally been marginalized in Ismaili studies. So it is in that context that, under the leadership of Dr. Daftari, we are venturing into this area of South Asia and Central Asia and created these new units. And a lot of their focus is talking about contemporary communities. Substantial populations of Ismailis live in Central Asia and South Asia. So we are not just talking about historical traditions of the past. We are engaging now in contemporary issues. And some of these populations, as you know, are in areas of the world where there's a lot of polarization of identities, all kinds of issues of representation, and so on. And so the work of the IAS in studying these areas has a real life application to issues that these societies faced. And so, so I think the Central Asia unit is doing incredible work. I think they're just at the brink of publishing some new works that will be coming. So in that sense, I'm really happy that we are sort of at the cutting edge. So there's a new development in Ismaili studies for the IS, but I think also for the field generally. So with that, Hakim, do you want to say anything about the program? Okay. Yeah. So we're going to start our program with first Hakim, and he's going to talk about the multiplicities of meanings in the traditions of Central Asian Ismailis. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Asani, for your kind words. And thank you to all of you for coming to this session devoted to Central Asian Studies. Today in the morning, Professor Virani talked about the importance of studying text, in addition to importance of studying written materials in addition to manuscripts. And I would like to take this step further, that there is also a large body of oral materials of the community which also need to be explored and needs to be studied. And he talked about Pir Sabzali, and indeed in the Central Asian tradition we have a large body of oral materials about Pir Sabzali visiting Central Asia and how he was received by the community in the region. As Professor Asani mentioned, one of the things we try to do is to document the rich traditions of Central Asian Ismailis and make available some of it in some written academic form. And oral histories and documenting the history of the community is an important part of our activity. And today I'm talking about this multiplicity of meaning in the traditions of the Central Asian Ismaili, with particular focus on the meaning which the oral traditions brings into the text, into the written or the manuscripts or religious texts we are talking. So many religious traditions incorporate various belief systems to form a unified and organized religious system with key doctrines which are central to their teaching. This is also true of the Ismailis, and particularly the Ismailis of Central Asia, who preserve the distinctive religious traditions which have evolved over many centuries under the influence of various Islamic and pre-Islamic traditions. Their traditional belief system and religious rites and rituals bear the imprint of various civilizations which dominated the cultural landscape of Central Asia in various periods of the history. So to begin with, I just want to provide this general overview of the geographical locations of the Ismaili, as this is also the first session which talks about the Central Asian Ismailis. So as you can see, the community is mostly located or spread in the mountain regions of Central Asia and in the borders of Tajikistan, Afghanistan, northern Pakistan, and western China. So these borders, which you can see in the current map, are just a recent development. They emerged about 120 years ago. But in the course of hundreds of years, this community interacted freely, and they have a sort of a common religious history and share many seminal Ismaili practices. And some of the distinctive features of the Ismailis of Central Asia should be highlighted. One is the diversity. We have ethnic groups who speak over 15 languages, such as Pamiri languages, Aryan, Dardic languages, even Brusheski, which is one of the oldest languages, and other dialects. And many of these languages, of course, are spoken only by Ismailis, and they are considered endangered. These communities are also holders of some of the most ancient languages and cultures. And as you probably know, one of the Silk Roads passed namely through the Pamir to Wakhan region. And that's another indication of how this imprint of the various civilizations left their mark on the current traditions of the community. And some of the nations like Scythians, Sogdians, and Baktrians, which at some point dominated the vast area of Central Asia, today are preserved from the linguistic point of view by the communities in these mountain regions. Another distinctive feature of the community is the religious literature. That is, they all share Persian or Dari language as a written language and as a language of the Ismaili faith. But this doesn't mean that the community who speak these various languages was not involved in creation of literature, religious literature in Persian language. It was a language of literature for them. It was a written languages. And today we find many written manuscripts which were created namely by these indigenous people. The other important aspect of the community is the adherence to the Nāṣir-i Khusraw tradition. As you know, although if you travel across these mountain regions, you will find that many traditions in the community practices are namely associated with Nāṣir-i Khusraw, who is believed to be the founder of the Ismailis in the region. Although, when we look at some of the practices, we will see that the community associated with Nāṣir-i Khusraw, although the analysis of those practices in text doesn't necessarily indicate that they were created by Nāṣir-i Khusraw, but he has become sort of a legendary figure with whom most of these practices are associated. So to begin with, I think some of the conditions which, or preconditions which define my approach to looking at the multiplicity of the tradition is that religion is part of the culture. And not everybody would agree with that, but it is from this point of view that I will look at the multiplicity of traditions. So many religious, the question of meaning and the multiplicity of meanings emerges from the question of place of religion in culture and our understanding of relation between culture and religion. If we are to consider religion as part of culture, it seems sensible to explore religion and religious beliefs in relation to other elements of culture. That is, to explore the belief system of the community in its totality. Religious traditions are anchored in the culture, which is much broader and to a great extent defines the rites and rituals which the community performs to express their religious beliefs. The second point is local Islam versus official Islam. And we sense that, or we know that the Islamic studies are often conceptualized as a field exploring the dominant religion in society, which the communities associate themselves with, and often in isolation from the cultural practices of the society. We tend to look at the so-called Islamic rites and rituals as deriving from the Islamic interpretation of the faith, and discard what is not fitted into that interpretation as cultural practices and beliefs, often labeled as superstitions, which emerged in that cultural space due to geographical, social, political, or economic reasons in a distant past. Being in the periphery of Islamic culture or the birthplace of Islamic teachings, a local Islam largely draws on the existing beliefs and practices. Very often, in the process of crystallization of Islamic practices, many dimensions of belief system and practices are often cast aside as a remnant of some old beliefs which are not worthy of consideration. However, it seems without understanding and appreciating the various nuances of the practices of the faith, there is a danger of throwing a baby with the bathwater. Therefore, local Islam projects itself as an important dimension of Islamic diversity and pluralism as well. In the context of the belief system of Central Asian Ismaili Muslims, and particularly the Ismailis of the region, we observe a strong presence of the pre-Islamic beliefs in cults which have taken unspoken or implicit but discernible place in the religious practices of the community, including those which are associated with Ismailis. So the cult of fire, nature, and ancestral spirits occupy a prominent place in the way the community relates to their tradition. And finally, the dimension of diversity of Islamic practices is best understood when we juxtapose the religious texts with rituals which accompanies its recitation, and which I try to show further. Now, as conceptual framework, I have drawn on the work of two fundamental, in my view, works. One is the Maps of Meaning, which is written by the Canadian intellectual Jordan Peterson. He traces the origins of meaning or knowledge in human experience. Peterson, from a psychological point of perspective, have argued that knowledge and meanings are rooted in the human voluntary confrontation with the unknown, the chaos, or the dragon, so to speak, as a precondition for attaining or conquering the unexplored territories. Myths, rituals appear as initial attempt to make sense of and to express the abstract relation with the unknown. Furthermore, he maintains that the comparative analysis of the great body of religious philosophy might allow us to provisionally determine the nature of essential human motivation and morality. Thus, understanding the rituals may shed light to the belief and value system of the community. The second work which I want to highlight here is written by a Tajik scholar, Rahmat Rahimov. It's called The Quran and Pink Flame. The book is in Russian. And Rahmat Rahimov, he reviews various ethnographic studies conducted by the Russian and Soviet scholars in various parts of Central Asia, and concludes that in Central Asian context, the official Islam, as expressed in the performance of prayers, attendance of mosques, is largely associated with men, while local traditional practices are led by or determined by female religiosity. The subject of his investigation were traditions in which fire takes a central place. The phenomenon of fire is that it has the capacity to immerse a person in a state which is comparable with the silent prayer and contemplation. As the Zoroastrian states, we pray to God through fire, can be interpreted as a believer turns his internal faculties to God through fire based on the conviction that this pure element of creation, which is with its magical power, by the power of the flame and brightness, can deliver the prayers to God. Rahmat Rahimov draws his conclusion from the observation of such customs as taking the bride around the fire 3 times before she enters the house of the groom. He enumerates cases of chiraghanas or tashkhana, houses of fire, in which women serve as custodian or perform various rites. Here is some example of chiragdan, the sort of niches in various forms which largely located next to the mazars or graves of prominent even Islamic figures, where the women come and put candle and make wishes such as conceiving a child. The interesting part is that these places are located in Sunni-dominated areas and often condemned by religious clergy. But the fact that they have survived for over a millennium, even around the intellectual centers like Bukhara and Samarkand, shows the resilience of these practices and profound meaning which people attach to them. While we don't have exactly the same practices like taking a bride round a fire, in the Ismaili populated areas, a similar tradition or rituals which are closely associated with fire prevail in mountain regions of Badakhshan. There is a discernible presence of cult of fire associated to ancestral spirit and nature, which are deeply rooted in the traditions of the community, and many elements of those are embodied in what we define today as Ismaili tradition. Now, I don't have much time, but just to draw on importance of relation between practice and ritual and the meaning of a light or candle on those, we can look at the practice of Chirag Roshan, which is part of a larger burial ceremony in a Central Asian context, and it is a culmination of the funeral ceremony. That is after, on the 3rd day of death of a person, this practice is performed. Chirag Roshan is performed according to a book which is known as a Book of Light, and it emphasizes the importance of wahdat, nubuwat, and imamat. And symbolism of light is an important aspect of that, which is alluded to a Quranic verse and define light manifested everlasting chain of the imamat. Now, here's some example of how the chirag or the candle is made in the context of Central Asia. I won't be able to have time to elaborate on all of this, but just to demonstrate that it is important part of the ritualistic aspect is important part of the Chirag Roshan, and how the candle which is created during the ceremony is also taken to the bereaved family and as a form of blessing. So quickly, if we to compare text with the ritual, we can see that in the text, the concept of light as nur is a manifestation of imam and everlasting chain of the imamat. But in the ritual itself, if you incorporate the oral tradition, is a sign of a purification, sacralization, and cleansing, which is also manifested in the way the candle is made. There is a Islamic interpretation of the origins of Chirag, where it is passed from Allah to Muhammad and his progeny, and the ritualistic aspect of it is the connection with the sacred. Final part of this ceremony, we observe the recitation, the text, I mean the recitation and supplication of prayers for the well-being of the community and bereaved family and the departed soul, while in the ritualistic aspect, we observe the serving of the sacred food known as boj, and it is just prepared particularly for this ceremony, where the community ingest the sacred food and offer prayers for the soul of the deceased. Yeah. Thank you. So let me, I think, some example of the chirag, which are also manifested in different practices, such as sarawak, is made out of the juniper tree, and it is done in various occasions, including in funeral ceremonies. And it also expresses some of those various meanings which are attached to the fire or candle. And from, as we can see, is it is done for the sake of the Imam of the time, satisfaction of the spirits, enlightens the path of the soul to its origin, takes away the sins of the deceased soul. It's a sacred place. It's done for the sake of 5 holy bodies, that is the Panch Tanipok. And important part of it, of course, the female supplication. Another example of this is what we call strach, which is burnt as an incense. This is a sort of a flowering plant. I think I should finish right. I just want to conclude with some concluding remarks. The believers in Central Asia draw upon the dominant religion and the beliefs in cults. The Islamic practices are the consequence of past adaptation, the integrated and represented residue of the past pre-Islamic beliefs and rituals. The seminal Ismaili traditions draw on the Islamic esoteric traditions, such as Sufi and Shia, which are harmonized with the ancient beliefs, adding supplementary meaning and dimensions to the Ismaili traditions. The ancient beliefs are part of the larger narratives which form the beliefs and the value system of the community. The religious texts do not always capture the variety of meanings which are vested in the religious traditions and practices. The exploration of these beliefs requires interdisciplinary research, and while we progressed in textual analysis, there is much to be explored through other disciplines such as anthropology and psychology. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, moving on, I'm going to resist making comments. There's tons of very rich material here, but we'll just move on to the next one. And so we have Nourmamadcho. We'll be talking about the Muḥammad-Shāhī and Qāṣim-Shāhī Nīzāris in Badakhshan and their unification in the 17th century.
First of all, thank you to the organizer of the conference, particularly to Dr. Daftari and Dariush Mohammadpur for inviting me to present my work in this conference.
Closer to the mic.
Closer.
And I would like to mention that this is a work in progress because many other documents are coming up from the Badakhshan, particularly in the manuscripts that are housed in the Ismaili special collections, and also manuscripts which are found by Joanne Gross and Daniel Beeben, which are available from Princeton University's digital library online. So the preliminary discussion, the discussion here is not conclusive, but I'm waiting for feedbacks as well to improve the work. So the topic is the Muḥammad-Shāhī and Qāṣim-Shāhī Nīzāris in Badakhshan and their unification in the 17th century. In the 16th century witnessed the rise of the Safavids in Iran, the Shaybanis and Mawara-Hunnar, and the Mughals in India. It was a period of political instability which resulted in reshaping the religious and political life of these regions by the new ruling elite. Badakhshan, a mountainous region at the foothill of Hindu Kush, became a staging point of the last Timurids, namely Babur Padshah and his descendants, who lost Mawara-Hunnar to the Shaybanids. Later in the first half of the 16th century, the last Timurids, or the Mughals of India, made a deal with the Safavids, who helped them regain control of their lost lands, which resulted in spreading the 12 Shi'i teaching in the regions controlled by the Mughals. Particularly, the case in point is Badakhshan, where various religious denominations such as Ismailis, the 12 Shi'is, Sufis and Sunnis resided side by side for many generations. These religious groups struggled for power and control in the region and hence made effort to oust out the competing parties. Obviously, such competition in the medieval and early modern period resulted in appropriating religious figures, changing genealogies, and misrepresenting the competing groups. Among these political and religious changes that took place between bigger powers in this period, the struggle for religious control among the minorities, as late Professor Leonard Lewison said, remained an unimportant news coverage to be included in the mainstream historical chronicles. The topic to be discussed is the Nizari Muḥammad-Shāhī, the Nizari Qāṣim-Shāhī split and their influence in Badakhshan. And for the sake of time, I will just use Muḥammad-Shāhī and Qāṣim-Shāhī to refer to the Nizari in a broader sense. The mainstream historical sources from the 15th to the 18th century do not provide any discussions about these lines unless it is important. For instance, in the 1460s, Ali bin Qasim al-Musawi al-Najafi produced a marginal note in a genealogy book which is preserved in the British Library under the number MS 1406. The author's interest was obvious that he was collecting the genealogy of Alids, and in collecting data on Shi'i genealogy, and hence he includes this marginal note on folio 25b under the rubric Mazhab or religious groups. In his discussion, he refers to the attestation of the Muḥammad-Shāhīs and calls them Khundiya or Khudawandiya, which is open for discussion as well. In the modern time, it was Vladimir Ivanov who discussed the issue of Muḥammad-Shāhī and Qāṣim-Shāhī split in his 1938 article, A Forgotten Branch of the Ismailis. Ivanov mentions that after the death of the 28th Ismaili Imam, Shamsuddin Muhammad, who died in 1310, an obscure dispute over his succession arose within his family that divided these Nizari Ismailis into Qāṣim-Shāhī and Muḥammad-Shāhī lines. Modern scholars argue that the schism is an obscure one, as no reference to it is given in early historical sources. However, the split is discussed in the oral tradition of the Muhammad-Shāhīs of Syria, that the split occurred after the death of Shamsuddin Muhammad. The Syrian Muhammad-Shāhīs are of opinion that Shamsuddin Muhammad had three sons, Alauddin Muhammad, Qāṣim-Shāhī, and Kiyō-Shāh. The dispute arose between Alauddin and the elder son of Shamsuddin and his younger brother Qāṣim-Shāh, who according to the Syrian oral tradition is considered the Hujjat of Alauddin Mumin Shah. A different narrative of this schism is presented in the Irshad al-Talibin fi Zikr A'immat al-Ismailin, ascribed to Muhib Qunduzi and copied in 1523. According to this source, the split occurred after the death of Mumin Shah, rather than Shamsuddin Muhammad. The sources from Badakhshan and South Asia present Mumin Shah as the son of Shamsuddin Muhammad. We learn from these sources that Nourmamadcho and Qāṣim-Shāh, grandson of Shamsuddin Muhammad, were brothers who contested the office of Imamat after their father, Mumin Shah. The question becomes more complex due to the absence of Mumin Shah's name in the Qāṣim-Shāhī Shajara genealogy. Hence, the schism remains an unresolved puzzle which awaits further research. It is evident from sources in our disposal that the newly emerging sources from Badakhshan that the presence of these two lines in Badakhshan requires further studies, which is evident in the 63 documents collected by Johann Gross and some other documents which are in our collection as well. The presence of the Muhammad-Shāhī and Qāṣim-Shāhī lines in Badakhshan and the contest for winning new converts in Badakhshan appears in the 15th century Qāṣim-Shāhī source, the Hafnukta. In one of these sections, we read that previously the people of Badakhshan, the fortress of Zafar, the realm of Egypt in Narjawan, and other places followed the true summons, but at the instigation of that faction, they may have been drawn in the ocean of iniquity. Now the foremost duty of the Muallims, or the peers of the present time, is to make every possible human effort to guide the community to the true path, according to the decree of Imams, meaning the farmans of the Imam. It is evident from this passage that the Ismailis of Badakhshan, who followed the Qāṣim-Shāhī line, at some point in the 15th century started following the Muhammad-Shāhī line. This clearly shows that the split brought a degree of disorganization to the Nizari communities on a larger scale, particularly from the 15th century onwards. Although the split occurred in the 15th century in Iran, the new splinter group continuously attempted to legitimize the claims of the Imams from their respective lines until the 17th and 18th centuries. Even though this schism divided the Nizaris, the communities residing in Badakhshan maintained relationship with both lines. This is clearly seen in sources emerging from Badakhshan. Similarly, it implies that both lines were actively engaged in the religious life in Badakhshan until the followers of Muhammad-Shāhī line merged with the Qāṣim-Shāhīs. It is important to note that there is no information available on the doctrinal and practices of the Muhammad-Shāhī Nizaris in Badakhshan. What is known from fragmentary sources is that the Muhammad-Shāhīs propagated their doctrine under the guise of the 12 Shi'ism. The question of when and how the Muhammad-Shāhī succeeded in spreading their teaching to Badakhshan and on what doctrinal ground remains a question for further studies. As we know, the Ismailis of Badakhshan followed the Fatimid teaching through the writing of Nāṣir-i Khusraw. Although there were sporadic connections with the Nizaris of Iran, no concrete evidence is presented in the sources about the doctrinal changes among the Muhammad-Shāhīs in the region. The influence of the Nizari Muhammad-Shāhīs in Badakhshan was more prominent during the imamate of Raziyuddin II bin Tahir, who succeeded his father, Tahir bin Raziyuddin, who passed away in 1463. Raziyuddin's imamate, or peership, coincides with the advance of the Timurids into Badakhshan. It must be emphasized that Raziyuddin is the only high-ranking dignitary in the Ismaili Muhammad-Shāhī hierarchy who do not live in Badakhshan, but was the active ruler of the region from 1505 to 1510. It is highly likely that Shah Raziyuddin managed to consolidate the local population against the encroachment of the Shaybanids from the Central Asia and the last Timurids or the Mughals of India. Because the political situation in the region was unsafe, it is likely that the Imam Raziyuddin and his close associates refrained from producing any doctrinal works in the region. Eventually, Raziyuddin was brutally executed by the Timurids and was succeeded by his son Shah Dakhani, who, due to persecution by Safavids, migrated from Iran to India, and the community in Badakhshan lost connection with the leader. We learn from Tarikh Rashidi that Shah Raziyuddin was the hereditary spiritual leader of these people, to whom and to whose ancestors they had never failed to pay their annual tithes. It is important to note that the Tarikh Rashidi does not use any term to refer to the leaders of the Muhammad-Shāhī, but specifically points to Shah Raziyuddin as the hereditary peer of the community. We learn from Silki Goharez, a work produced in Badakhshan, sometimes in the 18th century, about the activities of Muhammad-Shāhī representatives in Badakhshan. A certain Sayyid Mehtar was the local representative of the Muhammad-Shāhīs during the reign of Muhammadcho bin Mumin Shah, who passed away in 1404. His successor is listed as Sayyid Ali, who was followed by certain Sayyid Salman. It is important to note that the term Rahi is used in Goharez in relation to high-ranking dignitaries of the Muhammad-Shāhī line. These Rahis called people to Maulana Mumin Shah, to the Mumin Shāhī line teaching, whereby the Silki Goharez does not provide any specific historical time frame for their activity. A document found by Joanne Gross, Daniel Biben, and Umer Sherzhachoev, entitled Attestation of Sayyid's Status of the Khoja Mehtar, which is dated to 21st Shawwal, 1083, or 9th February 1673, provides a new avenue for identifying the activities of the above-mentioned Muhammad-Shāhī Rahis in Badakhshan. And I found this document 2 days ago before I finished my paper, so I could not go into details and find out the genealogical line that they present here. However, it is important to note that based on this document, and if we compare it with the writing of Silki Goharez, it turns out to be that the Sayyid Mehtar was active in the 17th century, possibly in the first half of the 17th century. It needs to be mentioned that the Muhammad-Shāhī Imams had a large number of followers in Syria, Iran, Badakhshan, and India. Their presence and prominence in India is directly related to the activity of Shah Dakhani and his successors. It is safe to assume that after the death of Raziyuddin, at some point in the 16th and 17th century, the followers of the Muhammad-Shāhīs in Badakhshan started to change their allegiance to the Qāṣim-Shāhī line of Imamat. The presence of the Qāṣim-Shāhī teaching in Badakhshan is much longer, and we have more records about it. And it is also a logical continuation of Ismaili tradition in Badakhshan. Shafiq Virani, in his book, which was published in 2007, refers to a document entitled Decree of the Imam Abdus Salam, Farmoni Shah Abdus Salam, which was found by Ivanov and Majmua in Kirman. Ivanov states that this document bears the signature of Shah Abdus Salam, and in the beginning of the presentation I quoted a section from this work. This epistle, says Ivanov, Shafiq, addresses to the Ismailis of Badakhshan and Kabul, who followed the Imams of the Muhammad-Shāhī line. inviting the erring people to reconsider the ground for their allegiance and return to the fold of the right line of the Imams, that is to say, the Qāṣim-Shāhī line. We have some evidence in the manuscript sources in our collection that this particular section was used by both lines, and the name of Imams, namely the Imam of the time, and the name of was changed to the Qāṣim-Shāhī or vice versa to Muḥammad-Shāhī in order to propagate their teaching. A similar statement found in other manuscripts in Badakhshan clearly shows that the text was appropriated, even though the text may have been composed by the Qāṣim-Shāhīs or vice versa. The sentence, "and return to the fold of the right line of Imams," that is to say, Qāṣim-Shāhī was in state of continuous change, as the Muḥammad-Shāhī representatives used it to win the Qāṣim-Shāhīs to their fold, and as I mentioned, the other way around as well. It should be noted that the Qāṣim-Shāhīs of Badakhshan had contact with the Imams through these dignitaries who visited the Imams in Iran. The Silki Goharez employs the term Hadi in relation to the Qāṣim-Shāhī high-ranking dignitaries. We learn from Silki Goharez that a certain Sayyid Salman Abdul, Sayyid Muhammad Darwish, Sayyid Nuruddin Muhammad, Sayyid Salman II, and Khoja Malik Ato and Khoja Masum called the people of Badakhshan to the Qāṣim-Shāhī line. It is important to mention that in the Silki Goharez, the author intentionally uses two terms, Rahi, the person who shows the direction to the Imam or to the leader, and Hadi in different lines. So for the Qāṣim-Shāhī line, he specifically uses the term Hadi, which does not change throughout the text, and it is easy to identify which line he's talking about. It should be noted it was during the imamate of Imam Zulfiqar Ali in the second half of the 16th century when the Muḥammad-Shāhīs of Badakhshan started to join the Qāṣim-Shāhī Imam. According to the narrative in Silki Goharez, which in some part appears in the poetic form, Khoja Masum visited Imam Zulfiqar Ali, the 37th Qāṣim-Shāhī Imam who lived in Anjudan. The precise date of his visit is not recorded in Silki Goharez, which may have taken place in the first half of the 17th century, and the text of the poem appears on the screen. The Silki Goharez furthermore refers to the visit of another Pir, Khoja Muhammad Soleh, which can be considered the last point of return of the Qāṣim-Shāhī line, return of the Muḥammad-Shāhī to Qāṣim-Shāhī line. The passage reads, "As the wine of divine unity was handed to Khoja Muhammad Soleh, as a whirling particle ascending the rays of sunlight, he began his quest for the sun face of Maulana. And enduring through an untiring search, he finally reached that world-illuminating sun," meaning Maulana Shahidin Hassan bin Maulana Sayyid Ali, and drank the wine of divine unity from the cup of his companions who were intimates of his audience. Although the text of Silki Goharez is permeated with Sufi expression such as the wine of divine unity and the world-illuminating sun, referring to the Qāṣim-Shāhī Imams, it clearly gives the name of the Imam of the Shahidin Hassan, who also known as Sayyid Hassan Beg, who succeeded to the imamate after the death of his father, Imam Sayyid Ali, in 1754. This event has been discussed by a number of modern scholars who propose that this event must have taken place sometimes in 1730. However, this proposed date, which seems unconvincing. The text of Silki Goharez clearly indicates that Khoja Muhammad Soleh visited the Qāṣim-Shāhī Imam, whose pure name was Maulana Shahidin Hassan bin Maulana Sayyid Ali, who was the 42nd Qāṣim-Shāhī Imam of the time. Hence, it is safe to conclude that this event happened after the death of Imam Hassan Ali and therefore took place much later than 1754. It follows that the second half of the 18th century marks the final unification process of the Qāṣim-Shāhī Nīzāris with Muḥammad-Shāhīs of Badakhshan, Muḥammad-Shāhīs with Qāṣim-Shāhīs in Badakhshan, which had been completed by the time of the visit of Khwaja Saleh to the court of Imam in Iran. So the conclusion, the overlapping themes in this discourse of transformation do not allow us to mark the phenomenon with a specific date. What seems obvious in this regard is that the transformation was a long and slow process that might have started a few decades after the death of Imam Raziuddin II in the early 16th century, which was caused by the absence of contact with Shah Toir Dakan and his ancestors. While the Muhammad-Shāhī line became extinct at some point around the end of 18th century, the Qāṣim-Shāhī line continues to the present day, expressing the devotion to the Imams from the Ahl al-Bayt. The Ismailis of Badakhshan refer to themselves by means of expressing their allegiance still in the Fatimid time, in the Fatimid teaching through the writing of Nāṣir-i Khusraw, which was the historical evolution of Ismailism in Badakhshan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Our next presentation is going to be, I think we're going to get Daniel.
Oh, is he coming?
I think he's going to be on Zoom.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah, so our next presentation is by Daniel Bevin, and he's going to be presenting via Zoom, or I think it's a recording, and he's going to be talking about the descendants of Sayyid, Suhrāb, Walī, and Ismailism in early modern Badakhshan.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm not able to turn on my video here, but are you able to see my slides at least? Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry I could not be with you there in person today, but I'm very grateful for the opportunity to present to you here in this forum. And I'd like to begin my presentation today. Oops, 1 second. I want to begin my presentation today by showing a document from Badakhshan, and it turns out this is actually the same document that we saw a few moments ago in Nour's presentation. And this is a document dated to the year 1083 of the Hijri, or 1673, presenting a genealogy, a nasab-nama, and an attestation of the Sayyid status of an Ismaili by the name of Sayyid Mehtar, son of Khwaja Muhammad Fadl. And this individual is shown here as a descendant of a figure by the name of Sayyid Suhrāb. Sayyid Suhrāb is a sort of quasi-legendary peer within the Central Asian Ismaili tradition, who is said to have been the chief disciple and successor of Nāṣir-i Khusraw and the leader of the Dawah within Badakhshan after him. I'll say a bit more later about the figure of Sayyid Suhrāb himself, but what I want to call attention to here in particular are the names of some of the people who signed this attestation document. Among them is the ruler of Badakhshan at this time, whose name is Yari Beg, and who was in fact the founder of a new dynasty who had just recently come to power within Badakhshan. And this is a bit perplexing because the Yari dynasty, as it is commonly known, was otherwise renowned for its pronounced hostility towards the Ismailis. In fact, other representatives of this dynasty are recorded as having carried out major massacres and persecutions of Ismailis. And yet here they are also endorsing the Sayyid status of an Ismaili peer. In fact, this happened on at least 2 other later occasions that we know of from these documents. So how do we explain this? Well, I'll return to this particular question in a few minutes, but I raise it here as a way of illustrating one of the many ways in which genealogical documents such as this can serve as an important source for the social history of Ismaili communities. The texts that I'm discussing here today are part of a collection that was assembled through a three-year project by me and my colleague, Dr. Joanne Gross of the College of New Jersey, which was funded by a collaborative research grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Altogether, we identified and took images of over 70 genealogical texts from private collections in the Badakhshan region, including from both Tajikistan and Afghanistan. And with the permission of the owners, these have been now made publicly available on the project website, which you can see on the right side here, which is hosted by the Princeton University Library. and the original copies remained with their owners. And my paper today is based on material from our forthcoming book related to this project. Now, with very few exceptions, nearly all of the genealogies in this collection are related to prominent families within the Badakhshan region. Most of them in the pre-Soviet era had held positions of either religious or political leadership of some sort. And within this collection, there is one distinct category of documents that will be the focus of my discussion here today. And this consists of documents traced back to the figure of Sayyid Suhrāb. Sayyid Suhrāb figures prominently within the hagiographical tradition of the Nīzāris of Badakhshan, in which he is presented as a disciple of Nāṣir-i Khusraw, but not just any disciple. In fact, he is shown as the adopted son and designated successor of Nāṣir, and also the head of the Dawa within Badakhshan after him. This narrative tradition first appears in a text from the early 19th century, the Soki Goharis, which has been mentioned by several previous speakers, and which was written by a descendant of Sayyid Suhrāb. But interestingly, there's also other evidence placing him within a 15th century framework. I don't have time to discuss that now, but I go into more detail within the paper. Sayyid Suhrāb also has a substantial genealogical legacy within Badakhshan. There are a number of families and lineages claiming descent from him that, again, held high positions of authority within the Dawa in the past, and this is what I want to examine further here. Altogether, our project has identified 7 such genealogies from Badakhshan. Undoubtedly, there were many more of these in the past, but many of these sorts of documents were destroyed or lost in the early Soviet era. So this is what has come down to us. And to this collection, we can also add an 8th genealogy that is given by the author of the Soki Goharis, his own genealogy, which he presents within the text. So we actually have 8 genealogies in total, again, tracing back to the figure of Sayyid Suhrāb, and these date from the 17th century to the late 20th century. Now, there are a variety of methods that one can use to approach documents like this. What I'm proposing here is something I call the corpus level approach, in which rather than looking at the documents in isolation from one another, what I'm looking to do here is instead take a more quantitative approach to the documents as a whole and to look for patterns within the data. And in this case, there are 2 major patterns that I find to be significant. The first regards the time frame of Sayyid Suhrāb himself, and the second regards the subsequent development of his lineage traditions. So let's start with that of Sayyid Suhrāb himself. As I mentioned earlier, we have traditions data connecting him with 2 different time frames, 400 years apart from one another. And I believe that our documents here can add some information to this point. Now, I'm only going to touch upon this topic very briefly. In the book itself, I give a much more detailed discussion of my methodology and calculations, so I don't want to go into that here. But in summary, my calculations based on the genealogical data from these documents render an estimated birth date of Sayyid Suhrāb of around 1403, which would suggest that the 15th century chronology for him is probably more feasible. And it would also seem to suggest that the tradition linking him as a disciple of Nāṣir-i Khusraw probably evolved at a later time. So this is one interesting point that the documents reveal. But I want to spend a bit more time here focusing on the second point, which looks at the question of branching within the lineages. Now, all 8 of these genealogies obviously have a common point of origin, traced back to Sayyid Suhrāb himself. But at what point do they begin to diverge from one another, and what does this divergence signify? First, let's look at the evidence for this. If we do a comparison of our 8 genealogies, we can see that all of them agree on the first generation succeeding Sayyid Suhrāb, that he had a son named Shah Sayyid. And we see one early division that occurs then in the second generation after Shah Sayyid, forming a separate lineage that is attested in one of our documents. What's interesting is that the other 7 documents for the next 7 generations are entirely the same as one another. And this is true down to the figure of Salman Shah. And then we see a number of splits that occur in the 2 generations immediately following Salman Shah. So for some reason, we find a proliferation of lineages within these 2 generations in particular. Now, the question here is, what do these splits actually signify? It's important to keep in mind that this is not simply a family tree. There were undoubtedly many other children and branchings that occurred within each generation of each of these lineages. But only a small handful of these preserve their own textualized genealogical tradition. What each of these lineages signify is a position of authority within the Jamaat, within the Dawah. And each of these branchings represents an instance in which a descendant was able to not only establish himself as an autonomous source of authority within the community, but also to perpetuate that authority among his descendants over multiple generations. So I would argue that we should understand each of these branchings as a historical event of some sort, representing a multiplication of institutions of authority within the community. So why might this happen? On the one hand, it could represent an instance of division or schism within a community, but it could also just as easily be explained by an expansion of the community, of the development of new opportunities for leadership within the community, either through a growth in size, a growth in the population of the community, or it could represent a geographical expansion, a spread of the Dawah into new regions, which would naturally create new opportunities for leadership. So there could be a variety of explanations for this. What I'd like to look at next is what we might find if we were to line up these branchings with dates. And what I've done here, based on my initial calculation of the birth dates starting from Sayyid Suhrāb, is I presented an estimate of when each of these individuals would have been around 30 years old. In other words, the point at which we might expect them to have begun exerting leadership within the community. So the dates here are showing when each of these individuals would have entered into their the prime of their career. Now, our time frame here covers a period of approximately 3 centuries, and during this time, Badakhshan experienced 3 major periods of dynastic change, beginning with the Timurid conquest in 1466. It's interesting to note that all of our examples of branching appear to coincide with major shifts in the political order in Badakhshan. This is particularly the case with the establishment of the Yari dynasty in 1657, which was a very important event in the history of Badakhshan. Both the Timurids and the Uzbeks, who had conquered Badakhshan before them, were essentially annexing Badakhshan to a larger empire. What makes the Yarids unique is that this marks the first time since the Timurid conquest when Badakhshan once again becomes its own autonomous state and not simply a frontier province within a larger empire. But again, it's not immediately clear why this development would facilitate the branching that we see in the genealogical documentation. The Yarids are noted in the sources, again, for their very strong hostility towards Ismailism. In fact, one Yarid ruler in the 18th century carried out a major massacre of Ismailis in the Chitral region and is said to have taken away over 30,000 Ismailis as slaves. But nonetheless, as I mentioned, we find at least 3 occasions within the sources when rulers from the Yari dynasty certified the Sayyid status of descendants of Sayyid Suhrāb. We also find evidence of this from the Silki Guhari, some of which Noor summarized for us. And again, I don't have much time to discuss this here. I go into much more detail on this text and its evidence in my paper. But suffices to say that this text also provides a very clear references to an expansion of the community within Badakhshan starting from the late 17th century, referring to appointments of new leadership, expansion into new regions, and so on. So how do we explain this paradox? Well, I think we can begin by looking more closely at the internal geography of Badakhshan. We often talk about Badakhshan overall as a sort of periphery, one that exists on the margins of empires. But it's also important for us to look at internal center-periphery relationships within Badakhshan itself. Now, in the early modern period, beginning from the 15th century onwards, we can see 2 major centers of Ismailism developing within the greater Badakhshan region. There's a sort of core group centered in Yumgan and in surrounding districts in the more central regions of Badakhshan. And then there are other groups that appear somewhat later in the Pamir districts, in Shugnan and Wahan and so on. And we need to think about the relationship between these different groups, these different regions. Now, Yumgan, of course, is where we find the oldest Ismaili presence within Badakhshan. This is, of course, the place where Nāṣir-i Khusraw himself spent his final years. And I think some of us get a somewhat negative image of Yumgan based on Nāṣir's own writings, but we actually see from later sources that was actually one of the more agriculturally productive regions of Badakhshan. By contrast, the Pamirs are not so economically productive. The opportunities for agriculture in these highland areas was much more limited. We can also get a better sense of the distinction between these regions by looking at them in terms of elevation. So if we turn to this map here, we can see that while Yumgan is still located within a mountainous region, it is relatively lower in elevation and much more accessible to the administrative center of Badakhshan, which historically was based in the city of Faizabad. By contrast, the Pamiri districts, because of their relative inaccessibility, their higher elevation, often remained outside of state control and also periodically served as a site of refuge for migrants from other neighboring lowland areas who were escaping from persecution of various sorts. However, during times when we find a strong state presence within Badakhshan itself, rulers would often attempt to extend their control over the Pamiri districts as well. And there might be various reasons why they would want to do so. For example, the Wuhan region historically served as a major trade conduit with China. The Shugnan region in particular in earlier times is known to have held significant mineral wealth, although this appears to have declined sometime after the 16th century. But increasingly, it would appear that the most important resource, if you will, from these regions were the people themselves. And I'm referring here, of course, to the slave trade. Slaves from the Pamirs appear very widely throughout Central Asia down to its abolition in the late 19th century. And their enslavement was often legitimated on account of their Shi'i faith. So there is an interesting pattern we see developing in the early modern sources here. Whenever we find references in the sources to political activity among the Ismailis within the greater Badakhshan region, this always occurs at times when there is a weakening of central authority within Badakhshan, and not at times when there is strong authority within Badakhshan, and typically in response to an external invasion. So for example, the Uzbek ruler Muḥammad-Shāhī Khan invaded Badakhshan in 1505. The invasion was ultimately repelled, but it led to several years of political disorder within Badakhshan. And it's during the same period that we see an effort at an Ismaili state building project led by one of the Muḥammad-Shāhī Khans within the Darwaz region to the north. And Nour talked about this a little bit in his presentation. And this lasts for several years until the Tuaregs are able to reestablish authority within Badakhshan. Later in 1584, the Uzbek ruler Abdullah Khan again invades Badakhshan and this time succeeds in conquering it, but the Uzbeks have a very difficult time consolidating their control over Badakhshan. And it's during this period that for almost 40 years, there is an autonomous Ismaili state that emerges in the Rushan and Shugnan regions. And it's not until 1635 that it is finally crushed by the Uzbek ruler Nadir Muhammad Khan. In fact, every single reference that I have found to Ismailis in Badakhshan that appear in non-Ismaili sources from Central Asia between 1500 and 1800 have two things in common. First of all, they refer only to Ismailis in the Pamir districts and not within the more central districts of Badakhshan, even though we know they were there. And second, they mention them only in the context of their conflicts with Sunni states. So again, it's rather striking that we did not have any references in the sources to persecutions or conflicts with Ismaili communities within Yumgan or within the more central districts of Badakhshan, even though we know from the Ismaili sources that they were clearly there. What this suggests to me is that there was likely some sort of pragmatic accommodation between the Yarid state and the Ismailis within Yumgan and within these more central districts. And again, it's important to keep in mind that the Yarids themselves were trying to develop a state that was actually centered within Badakhshan. It was not simply a frontier province for them. It was actually the center of their state. And thus they were interested in the long-term economic development of the region. Now, because of its largely mountainous territory, Badakhshan has relatively few economic resources for developing a tax base. So there's a need to really maximize those resources that are available. And it was probably on that basis that the Yarids decided it would be in the interest of economic stability to leave the Ismailis of the Yumgan region alone, that they were more economically valuable as farmers, whereas the same economic logic did not apply to the Pamirs. But then the question emerges, is this an example of religious tolerance on the part of the Yarids? And if not, then how do we rectify this approach with the very sharp anti-Ismaili rhetoric associated with this dynasty? And it's here that I think we can look at some comparative examples from other early modern states in order to better understand this process. And I've given a list of some recommended readings here on this topic. In particular, over the last decade, there has emerged a vibrant discussion as to how the confessionalization framework from the study of the religious history of early modern Europe might be applied to the study of the Muslim world. This has been studied in particular with reference to the Ottoman Empire, where from the 16th century onwards, there is an increasingly concerted effort to promote and consolidate a Sunni religious identity for the empire's Muslim subjects. So whereas there is official tolerance promoted towards non-Muslim minorities, the same is not extended towards non-Sunni Muslim minorities. But yet, at the same time, if we actually look at the experience of the non-Sunni minorities within the Ottoman Empire, and in particular, there's been a lot of recent scholarship on the Alevi communities, who I think offer a useful point of comparison with the Ismailis of Central Asia. While these communities certainly did face periods of persecution, we also find evidence for a more subtle approach that is taken by the Ottoman state to work with elites within these communities to promote stability by encouraging taqiyya or dissimulation within the Sunni framework. As Derin Terzioglu argues, taqiyya in the early modern Ottoman Empire was not just something that minority communities practiced on their own initiative, but actually constituted a two-way performance between minorities and the state, that the state also has an interest in accepting and in fact even encouraging efforts at dissimulation among minorities as a means of promoting economic stability. Now, the problem for us here is that the Ottoman state left a much more significant paper trail than any of the early modern Central Asian states. So it's much more difficult for us to discern the motivations for the policies taken by the Nīzāris and Badakhshan. But I think the genealogical documents do offer us some hints, at least, that a similar process, a similar logic was perhaps underway within Badakhshan. What we see happening here and elsewhere is an example of how the Sayyid status of Ismaili elites can be used as a form of social capital, one that's easily translatable across confessional boundaries. It is something that gives the peers themselves status within the community, but it also offers an opportunity for rulers to demonstrate their patronage and support for descendants of the Prophet. And this is important for them to establish their religious legitimacy. So in a way, both parties stood to benefit from this recognition of Sayyid status and stood to benefit from the performance of dissimulation of taqiyya. So this is one good example, I think, of where genealogical documentation can provide a window into certain developments that might otherwise remain obscure. And I think it also, and this is my final point here, I think it demonstrates the source of the peers' authority within the Ismaili community. There was not just simply their genealogy, their status as Sayyids that gave them authority, but more importantly, it was also the way in which they were able to employ that status as leverage and to function as mediators between these marginalized communities and the state. The bulk of the research that has been done to date on the history of the Ismailis of Badakhshan has focused on the modern era, starting from the late 19th century, where we have much more extensive documentation available due to the involvement of Russian and British colonial interests in the region. And the studies from this later period have shown how the peers played a critical role as advocates and mediators for the Ismailis of Badakhshan in dealing with external powers. We have very little documentation available for earlier times, for the pre-colonial period, but I believe that genealogical documents such as this can provide some insight into these earlier periods. And they suggest that the profile of social activism of the peers that we see in sources from the colonial period was probably applicable for earlier periods as well. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, so Alice. So Alice will be talking about the development of Nāṣir-i Khusraw studies.
I want to thank the organizers of today's panel, of today's conference, of our all coming together after a terrible pandemic and keeping us apart. And I thank you all for coming and being brave to come out. And I also want to thank the organizing committee, particularly Dr. Dariush Mohammadpour and Dr. Daftari, as well as Julia and Noshin, who put in many, many hours to put this together. And I also like to welcome Dr. Zain Qāṣim as our new leader. This topic So, do I have my slides? The topic that I'm talking about tonight is the development of Nāṣir-i Khusraw studies at the suggestion of Dr. Daftari. And as I was working on it, it turned into a personal history for me, because I met Nāṣir-i Khusraw and Ismailism right at the beginning of my undergraduate studies at NYU 50 years ago. So I met Nāṣir-i Khusraw and Ismailism right at the beginning of my studies at NYU, and then in graduate school in Columbia with Professor Yarshater. But I met Mehdi Mohakkak, the editor of the Divan, Sayyid Hossein Nasr, Parviz Muravich, and these all became part of the threads of what was I studying, and why was I going to study, why was I studying Persian language and Arabic. And just in connection to earlier discussion of who's studying and who's writing, we had a discussion about that early this morning. My background is that I'm an American daughter of a Methodist minister from rural upstate New York with apple trees and dairy farms. And but my father's mother was born a missionary in Bombay in the 1800s, and her grandparents had gone over there, American missionaries, in the 1830s. So we have a strong Bombay connection in the house in upstate New York. And then in 1976, my first trip to Iran, I unexpectedly found myself a house guest in the house of Dr. Mehdi Mohakkak. And they set up my bed, my little cot on the floor, in the library. So I could go to sleep looking at the carpet or at the books. And it's going too fast. This is the outline of the talk. I can only show, of course, the highlights of the history of scholarship on Nāṣir-i Khusraw. So first we'll look at as we've learned today, at this conference also, first we have to find the manuscripts, then we have to have the editions, and then the translations. And in Nāṣir-i Khusraw, we have three genres that we're looking at. We have poetry and his Safarnameh and his philosophy. Then we look at the analyses, and then how do we increase the scholarship, and then, as many speakers have also let us know today, we need to know about the living Ismaili community. In 1977, at the suggestion of His Highness Sadruddin Aga Khan, Professor Sayyid Hossein Nasr published a volume at the Academy of Philosophy in Tehran, pictured here, to celebrate the occasion of the centenary of the birth of the late Aga Khan, who had been born in 1877. Titled Ismaili Contributions to Islamic Culture, it did not have one article on Nāṣir-i Khusraw. It is precisely a testament to the tremendous growth of Nāṣir-i Khusraw studies that such an omission would be unthinkable today. So we'll start with the poetry. Nāṣir-i Khusraw's Divan was first published in lithograph form in 1863 in Tabriz, Western Iran. Then 30 years later, in 1896, another lithograph appeared in Tehran. A few more followed in Bombay. Why Tabriz? Situated in Western Iran, Tabriz was midway between the Ottomans, the Russians, and Tehran, and the Persian Gulf. All the countries had consulates in Tabriz, including Britain, France, Russia, and the Ottomans. Qajar crown princes were sent there to learn to govern. The eminent Qajar education minister, Reza Qoli Khan Hedayat, devoted himself to editing Nāṣir-i Khusraw's Divan and also tutored the crown prince in Tabriz. This city bristled with political and economic energy. It was the first city in Iran to have a lithograph machine, and then the first to have a printing press. But the first critical edition of Nāṣir-i Khusraw's divan had to wait until after all the upheavals of the 1906 constitutional revolution, the First World War, the fall of the Qajar dynasty, and the rise of Reza Shah to the throne. The project was made historic by who was doing it. So we think first why, where, and who is interested in this topic. 4 of the leading scholars of the day were involved in it. A judge and a scholar, Sayyid Nasrullah Taqavi, assisted by Ali Akbar Dekhoda, who's famous for writing a whole encyclopedia of Persian phrases and language, and Mujtaba Minovi. The valuable biographical introduction was by the Persian scholar and politician Sayyid Hasan Taqizadeh. If you notice here in Persian, a recent republication of this edition, the only name of those 4 that's on the cover is the politician Taqizadeh. Who was he? He grew up. He was born in 1878, 1 year after the Aga Khan they were celebrating. He grew up in that bristling Tabriz and helped Iran shape itself toward modernity. As Professor Yarshater, my Columbia advisor, wrote in the dedication page of a volume of scholarly articles in honor of Taqizadeh, it is hard to suspect that his scholarship is the fruit of just a few mere hours, because throughout his life, it was really the work of state and government that preoccupied him. 50 years later, in 1973, Dabir Siaqi produced an edition which also came out in a popular series of selections of major Persian poets. In 1978 was the production of the Mehdi Mohaqqaq and Mujtaba Minovi divan, so the one where I was sleeping in bed in the library. And then we start coming to the translations. So in the late 70s, we have partial translations, 1977, P.L. Wilson and Walī at the Academy of Philosophy again in Tehran produced 40 poems from the divan. 20 years later, Anne-Marie Schimmel, whom we all love, her Make a Shield from Wisdom came out in 1993. And over the years, we've seen an increase in critical articles examining Nāṣir's poetry for its content and themes. But in 1993, Julie Scott Masami published an historic study of the structure of one of Nāṣir-i Khusraw's qasidas as part of her decades of work on Arabic and Persian qasidas. Masami showed that in analyzing Nāṣir-i Khusraw, we need to look not just at the ideas and not just at a few lines at a time, but to see how he lays out a qasida like a palace, as he says in one poem, or like a garden in another. You have borders and you have boundaries and you put specific things in different places. And so when everyone loves Nāṣir-i Khusraw's poetry, we need to give credit also to his techniques, his craft in constructing a poem as strong as a building that makes his poetry so memorable after 1,000 years and even to non-Ismailis. Besides his poetry, Nāṣir-i Khusraw also left one of the earliest travel diaries, the Safarnameh. Here's a map of his travels from from Marv over to Cairo and the Hajj. He went to the Hajj 3 times and then back home. The earliest edition of the Safarnameh was in 1881 by Charles Scheffer, who also translated it into French. 40 years later in 1922, so again, we have to wait for World War I to be over, right? 1922, Schaeffer's edition also served as the basis for a Berlin edition by Ghanizadeh, and then 50 years later, a Tehran published edition by Dabir Siaqi, who had also worked on the divan. I just want you to see this chronology. These are the editions from 1881 down to 1971, and look at the places. You see Paris, Delhi, Bombay, Tehran, Berlin, Tehran, Dushanbe, and Tehran again. And then translations also start in 1881, and they go down to, of the Safarnameh, go down to 2001. First the French, then the English, then the Russian, then an Urdu, then Arabic, then Turkish, then Arabic again, and then English and German, and English is reissued because now there's more interest in 2001. Just a personal note here again. I said this was a personal uncovering when I was at a conference in Iran about 5 years ago on Nāṣir-i Khusraw. They were showing up the slides of all Nāṣir-i Khusraw's works, and then there was one that said Safarnameh, Alice Hunsberger. And they said, oh, you wrote a book on, look at your book up there, aren't you happy? I'm like, I didn't write a book on Safarnameh, and what has been pirated. So they chopped up the Ruby of Badakhshan, took everything out that had to do with the Safarnameh and published it and put my name on the front, and they're along with themselves. So that's just, it's like, okay. The philosophical texts. Nāṣir-i Khusraw has 6 philosophical texts plus 2 more. So the main 6 that we look at, again, we look at 1923 for the major editions. In Berlin, Cairo, Leiden, and Tehran, Paris. So 1923, the Zad al-Musafirin, 1924, Vachidin, both in Berlin. Then 1940, Khan al-Ikhwan, Cairo. 1949, the Shish Fasle, Leiden. 1950, Goshayesh va Rahoyesh, also Leiden. And 1953, Jam al-Hikmatain. That's just quick. Now we'll go into, because the IIS now steps in. So let's look at these more carefully. The Zad al-Musafirin is edited in Berlin, is one of those early ones in Berlin in 1923. It still needs more work. The most recent work on it that I can find is 2011, and IIS republishing it in Tajik. Next one is Vajidin, one of the Berlin ones also, 1924, very early. Iranians, Ghanizadeh and Ghazvini. Oh, there were 4 Iranian presses in Berlin in the 20s. Then it's translated into Russian by Semenov in 1926, 1 chapter. Avani, again, for the Academy of Philosophy, is working on the Vajidin, the first critical edition in 77 in Tehran. And then the IIS again steps in, and we have some selections of it done by our Professor Hunzai, and in the Anthology of Ismaili Literature. Editors by Landolt, Sheikh, and Kassan in 2008. And then we have the Shish Fasl, edited by everyone's favorite Ivanov in 1949. And then Goshayesh va Rahoyesh in Leiden in 1950, and then an Italian translation in Naples, 1959, and then the IIS again in 1998. Fakir Hunzai has done a translation known as Knowledge and Liberation. Jam al-Hikmatain was first published by Corbin and Moin in Tehran and Paris in 1953, and then we had followed by other translations, Arabic, French, English, and now 2012, the IIS has published the English by Eric Ormsby. Khan al-Ikhwan is our newest IIS contribution. First, it was edited in 1940 by Yahya al-Khashab, but nothing since then until our student, in fact, one of my students, Dr. Rahim Gholami, who gave a paper earlier today, has finished a critical edition of the Persian text and produced an English translation. The 2 extra philosophical texts are the Roshanai Nameh and the Sa'adat Nameh, which attracted European interest in the 1880s, and it was published with the Berlin Safarnameh. And then Wickens, Professor Wickens up in Toronto, did a study, an article on it. And that this has, a lot of work has been done on Tajik on these 2 works, which are big favorites. let's see how far it went. So we have the analyses, Edward Granville Brown in 1905 and Arbery in 1958 has one mention of Nāṣir-i Khusraw with a debate about being one of the best of the Persian poets of all time, like Rumi and the others. But in the middle is 1975's The Cambridge History of Iran, the Seljuk period, edited by Richard Fry from Harvard. And it's filled with articles about coins and about tribes and about medicine and science. But there's only one chapter that's only about one person, and that's a chapter on Nāṣir-i Khusraw by Korban. Then we have the magnificent 1990, the most groundbreaking work on Ismaili Studies came out by our Professor Daftari. And then in 1992, I finished my doctoral dissertation on Nāṣir-i Khusraw's doctrine of the soul. And I sent it off to Dr. Daftari, and he said, that's a nice dissertation, but it's too philosophical. Could you write another book that takes into account his life and his travels and his poetry? So that's why it took so long. Finally, I had to come here and sit here and be a researcher. And it was published in 1999, The Ruby of Badakhshan. As the first book that weaves together all these three parts of him. But now, if you see, every book that comes out has an article about Nāṣir-i Khusraw in it. For example, Fortresses of the Intellect, edited by Omar Halide-Unzaga, has an article by Herman Landolt, Early Evidence for the Reception of Nāṣir-i Khusraw's Poetry in Sufism. In Tajikistan, there have been a number of conferences. The IIS has put together a number of conferences, but we should look at the conference that was in Iran even long before, in 1976, to celebrate his death. And that produced scores of articles about Nāṣir-i Khusraw. But the IIS's conference is a 2003 conference in Tajikistan to celebrate his birth. Was published edited by Sarfaraz Niyazov, and titled Tajik Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. And then also to celebrate Nāṣir-i Khusraw's millennium, I put together with the IIS and a lot of other organizations in London, I wanted to not be the only book out there. And so I wanted to bring in scholars who knew Persian poetry, but they had never worked on Nāṣir-i Khusraw before. So scholars of Rumi, scholars of other poets. I said, I want you to come to this conference. I want you to look at Nāṣir-i Khusraw's poetry from the side of poetry. And so that's what's published. We wanted to look at his craft, doing exactly what May Sami had asked back in 1993, that we need to look at him as a poet. And I also wanted to enlarge the field of scholars comfortable with Nāṣir-i Khusraw. A lot of scholars of Persian literature are afraid of Nāṣir-i Khusraw. They're afraid he's too philosophical. They like the love poetry better. And two scholars in both conferences, Leila Khodayeva and Marina Reisner, expanded their efforts, and at the suggestion of the IIS, Hakim Elnazarov published their work in Russian in a volume called Poetry as a Means of Preaching. And then there have also been conferences in St. Petersburg with articles about Nāṣir-i Khusraw in Russian, which I can't read, but the scholars are there. What we have here is a magnificent new book just out by another student of mine when I was here at the IIS, Dr. Dagiev. Central Asian Ismailis is a 3-part book, and it's available online, so I could study it. What he's done is look at all the Tajik and Russian books that say anything about Ismailism, I mean, hundreds of entries, And he has scores of books that, of articles and books that are written, that, and he's annotated it for us. The last slide. Where does this all lead us? What do we do here? We have here a student reader from Muslim devotions and ethical literature. Even Nāṣir-i Khusraw said it's not enough to learn. We must teach. And teaching is one of the greatest generosities. And one result of all the scholarly research on Nāṣir-i Khusraw is the ability to reshape it and reshape his lessons for all ages and ability. The Ismaili Education Board, ITREB, and the STEP programs, we have several of the leaders of the STEP program here with us, and the lifelong learning projects all produce high quality materials online and in hard copy. Here we see a lesson from the reader about Muslim devotions and ethical literature. In Unit 4, Travel, Journey, Search, see how Nāṣir-i Khusraw is paired with Nasiruddin Tusi at the beginning of the lesson. Can you read that on the right? Sort of. And then as you move down through the lessons, and it moves through Attar's Conference of the Birds, and that journey, and Rumi's journey. And then you catch up again at the end with Nāṣir-i Khusraw, this time paired with Pir Sadruddin and his journey to Alamut, and also Pir Sabzali's mission to Central Asia. The unit finally ends with a grand finale of the Didar, or Mu'alaqat, or the actual meeting of the Imam. And for this journey we've taken just now together, we can put over the past century and a half, this meeting with the Imam is probably the best place to leave. Thank you very much.